Labdien visiem! Patīkams jūs šeit esat. Mans vārds ir Dārzs Īvans. Es šodien stāstu priekšā mūsu viesi, Connie Fieldu, amerikāņu režisori, ļoti labu režisori. Sieviete, kas ir uzņēmusi vairākas pasaules slavenas filmas un guvusi lielu atzinību. Man ir prieks, ka tas notiek laikā, kad Rīga vispār ir kļuvusi par tādu nelielu dokumentālā kino pulsācijas vietu, jo tāpēc, ka vienlaikus notiek Baltijas fórums dokumentālajām filmām. Tas nozīmē, ka šeit pulsējās patiešām nozīmīgākie centrāla Eiropas un Austruma Eiropas režisori un arī cilvēki, kuri ir ieinteresēti atbalstīt dokumentālo kino. Vienlaikus sākās Arsenāla festivāls, kurā būs atsevišķas dokumentālās filmas, un arī Connie ir ar mums, un tas arī ir liels notikums, jo patiešām viņas daļa ir bijusi tāda ļoti plaša, tādā nozīmē, ka viņi ir atstājusi nozīmīgu ieguldījumu tieši sociālā dokumentālo filmu tradīcijā, un šajā ziņā ir jāpiemina vairākas viņas filmas. Viena no svarīgākajām viņas filmām, kas arī ir guvusi lielu atzinību, ir Rozijas Kniedētājas dzīve un laiki. Tas ir filma par amerikāņu sieviešu tiesībām strādāt darbus, kas patiesībā ir paredzēti kā vīriešiem, principā tāds feminismu uzplaukums pēc otrā pasaules kara sakarā ar sievietēm, kurām vajadzēja kara laikā pildīt vīriešu darbus. Tad otra filma, kur noteikti ir jāpiemina, tā patiešām ir ļoti sarežģīti veidot un tāda fundamentāla filma saucās Brīvība manā prātā, kas ir filma par 60. gadu sākumu Mississippi štatā un melnādaino amerikāņu cīņu par savām tiesībām. Šī filma tika nominēta Oskara balvai kā filmetrāžu dokumentālā filma. Šī filma ieguva Sundensā galveno žūrijas balvu un tiešām tāds nozīmīgs ieguldījums. Tad tajā jau ņemot vērā to, ka patiešām šajās režisors veidotajās filmās vienmēr ir apkopots milzums arhīvu materiālu, ļoti neredzētu arhīvu materiālu, tādas lietas, ko ikdienas skatītājiem vienmēr ir pārsteidzoši redzēt. Turklāt viņas ir veidotas ar lielu skrupulozitāti, tādu patiešām skaidru domu par to, kas tiek pateikts, un tā patiešām ir ļoti nozīmīgas sociālas tēmas, par kurām tiek runāts. Un šodien viņi mums pati pastāstīs par projektu, kas ir saistīts ar apartīdu režīmu un cīņu pret apartīdu Dienvidāfrikā. Tas ir liels fundamentāls arī projekts, kas sastāv no 7 filmām, bet par to Connie pat izstāstīs. So, it's your turn now. Introduce you. So now maybe something about the Johannesburg project.
I'll tell you something about the series.
Es ceru, ka visi saprot, angļu valodā mums nav jātulko.
Okay, and the film I'm going to show is part of a larger series of 7 films. It's 8.5 hours long, the whole series. I made 4 of the episodes feature length. I made 3 of them hour length. They're also cut down to 52 minutes for European TV, who demand that it's that length. But and the story is about the global movement involved in trying to end apartheid in South Africa. And the reason I got interested in it was because I feel, we really live in a globalized world, and our problems that we face in our societies are faced all over the world, and we're not going to be able to solve them unless we do it on that level. Everything's just too entwined. Our economies are too entwined. The way labor works and all of that. So it's, and this was basically a global story about changing something that, changing something that most people believed was going to end in a bloodbath. I mean, literally with people killing each other to death in civil war, and it didn't end that way. And it didn't end that way partly because of the people who were struggling. I think the African National Congress, which is Nelson Mandela's organization, I'm sure you all know who Nelson Mandela is. I think everybody in the world knows that. I think they were probably one of the smartest liberation movements to be able to harness the power of the rest of the world towards what they wanted to achieve. I think they did a better job of that than almost anybody has done. And the series that I made is about one part of that, and that's what the international world did and the effect it had inside South Africa. And I actually, it's a huge story. I covered 12 countries in over 50 years. It's really big. I'm very interested in how the world works politically and all those things, so it could keep my attention for all that time. And plus I have a very young staff and it kept theirs, so we found it interesting. But it's an extraordinary story. Another way I describe it, it's a portrait really of the world's march towards a global morality. The story really encompasses that. It begins really at the beginning of the United Nations and with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was trying to set a tone, for humanity and the whole world after the catastrophe of World War II. And that's exactly the same year that the National Party, with the Afrikaners, came into power in South Africa and really instituted apartheid. It was that same year. And then it's like they go off in one direction and the world goes off in another. So I deal a lot with macro-micro relationships, because I deal with what went on at the UN, what people were doing on the ground inside South Africa, and what ordinary citizens did in many countries around the world. That story was heavily impacted by the Cold War. It really got in the way of everything the ANC was trying to do, and it affected a lot. And South Africa was a big ally of the United States around Cold War issues. And the South Africans had a lot of very strong economic relationships to the United States and England. And in those countries where that geopolitical, relationship was primary, it really took the citizens inside those countries to make things move. In the story in the United States, it took a big mass movement, and a lot of it was spearheaded by African Americans. In our country, it's a great story about how it's the first time African Americans really changed U.S. foreign policy. It was over this issue, and forced the government to sanction South Africa. And without going into more details, but it ended up not a bloodbath. And the tactics that really won that struggle were nonviolent. Even though the ANC had a guerrilla army, because people all over southern Africa then were fighting that way, and they weren't given any legitimate means to have a political movement. That was really ended in 1960 when their organizations were banned and they went underground. There could be no demonstrations, so they saw no other way to do it but that. But it really didn't function very much. They were really far away from South Africa. South Africa had the biggest military on the entire continent. I mean, it never really would have worked. But I think psychologically it helped young people in that country to think that, oh, there's somebody out there fighting for us or whatever. But it was really the nonviolent things that won. And a lot of the things that got done in the outside world really affected what happened in South Africa. And the story that I'm going to show now is a story about the sports boycott. What people were trying to isolate the white people in South Africa from the world. They were supposed to trying to do it culturally and economically and politically, and that was kind of the battle. To try to make those people feel that, look, what you're doing really is not acceptable in our world, and you have to change. And we're not going to play ball with you until you do that. And so this is totally just about the sports campaign. It was very successful. It was the first international arena where they kind of won, and it's an interesting story, I think. So I'd be glad to talk about it afterwards. Anybody have any questions about the context? Do people here know a lot about apartheid?
I'm not sure. Maybe kāds ir jūs zināšanas par apartīdu?
Yes, no? You just speak up. Yes or no, or maybe, or nobody wants to say? Are you too embarrassed to say no?
We know the fact, but nothing more. We know probably what is apartheid, but probably that's all, not some deeper facts.
Okay, well, I don't think this episode has a ton of. This one really takes place outside of South Africa for the most part. But, so in a nutshell, it was racism that was codified in the legal system. Okay, and it was people had laws so that if people were black, they lived one place. If you were Indian, you lived another place. If you were colored, you lived another. I mean, down to almost every category of people were separated. And you were not allowed to intermarry. And the Africans got it the worst, and they were forced onto called homelands that the South African government had some kind of vision that these would be independent countries, even though it was on 13% of the land, and they had 83% of the rest, and this was the most barren land, and nobody could get jobs there, so all the Africans had to come into this too. Basically, they lived in townships around the white cities that were like workers' enclaves. Some of them were barracks, but everybody had their families, and they had to carry passbooks to go anywhere. It was a pretty wicked society that way, and it was. What's interesting about it is that hardly anybody in the rest of the world supported apartheid. Okay, so you've got a situation where everybody's against this thing, and so the question is, why don't they do anything? What's stopping them from doing it? So the story I tell also shows you that. Here is something that everybody condemns. I mean, this was condemned at the United Nations as a crime against humanity. It was badly condemned. And so throughout the whole story, you begin to see what was in the way of anybody really helping to change that. So
how about, for example, you have visited South Africa while making this film, and how about the situation right now? Because I have heard that still the communities are not so very well
well, of course not, but
close together in the sense that they have been integrated into
we
each
still
other.
have problems in the United States of America, and we ended slavery when? A long time ago. These things take a long time, and the biggest problem in South Africa is economic. I mean, it's really a country where it's a first world, third world country right together. Mm-hmm. And that nobody has moved economically in a way that has really been helping the poor people in South Africa. And what's gone on since then is a situation where a number of, and many of these people were the leaders of the liberation movements, because what they did is that when the corporations were coming back, the ANC made a lot of deals with international corporations, and part of it was to, also force them to have black people on their boards if they were going to operate there. So who gets to be on their boards? Well, the high up ones, and many of them are multimillionaires now. I mean, it was funny when I was showing my series, Work in Progress, in South Africa to various people and to students. In this one school, everybody wanted me to make a film about where they are now. I said, no, you make that film, it's not film for me to make. So that's a problem. And then along with that, they had kind of a political push, which they call black empowerment. And it's basically, it's only serviced, what the change is that now there's a wealthy black class of people in South Africa. Okay, and what's not changed is for the majority of the poor, things haven't changed enough. And but let me tell you, the hardest thing to do is not to throw out a tyrant. The hardest thing is to build an equitable society after that. It's much harder than getting rid of a terrible system. So I tell people a couple of things. It's that it's only been 15 years. That's not very much time. And in the film I made about Mississippi, that you saw, that Bob Moses, who is one of the leaders, this is a film about the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and I asked him what really changed about Mississippi and what they did, and he said, well, all they really did was bring Mississippi up to the level of the rest of the country. They just got rid of these, in essence, apartheid laws, really. And the right to vote. People have the right to vote. It never solved the problems of people in Mississippi, and that still exists today. So that's all that happened in South Africa. They just got rid of apartheid, on the books. But it's going to take them a very long time. And from my perspective, the problems that they face, the whole world faces. I mean, we have a much more unequal society in America than we've had in a really long time. And we have a lot of poverty in our own country. The poverty is a world issue. It's not just South Africa's problem. So, I guess I have a little bit more patience about it, though I think that there's a lot more struggle going on. I hope it doesn't get too dangerous, because I don't think, people don't follow it, but there's the Youth League and the ANC, and the guy that's head of that is, I think, potentially dangerous. But we'll see. But I think it takes a lot to try to make your society be, fair and economically equal.
And
I don't think
we don't know whether it's possible.
Yeah, nobody's quite.
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask one more question, and it's more touching the subject of freedom on my mind. That when I see your work, I see that you are so into the details, and you work with many kinds of archive material. You speak with many people, and I was curious. How it starts. I mean, how you start your work when you, for example, you see the subject that you want to speak about or to make a film about, and how you start seeking for those small bits and pieces to get them together and make the film.
You mean, how do I get the archives?
No, not how, but I mean, what is your starting point? What is the first thing you are doing?
Well, I think the first thing I do is try to figure out what the core center of the dynamic I'm exploring and what I'm exploring. Okay, and where the conflict is. Okay, like in the Mississippi film, you could make many films in many different ways, and you could have made a film about the conflict between the African Americans in Mississippi and the white people in Mississippi. I chose not to make that film. I chose to make a film of the conflict between the movement in Mississippi and the federal government. Okay, there was a different story that I wanted to tell. And I also wanted to tell a story I didn't get to tell because it made too long a film. It's, you know, films have their own life, and it's sort of some point, we ended up with like 3 films with that film because I wanted it from different people's points of view.
Or with 7 films.
Yeah, and to show people that, because what's historically important in America is that, you know, a lot of people, when you look at that era, the 60s and the 70s, and I don't know how much of you know anything about America during that time. Do you know what the 60s mean in America?
Segregation and...
yeah, it was a big fight against segregation, and we were fighting the war in Vietnam, and we started the women's movement that also spread all over the world. We did all of these things and started liberation for gay people, of which your people here are making films about, for Latvia. And it was an incredible sort of time during that time. And in this summer of '64, when they were fighting for the rights of the blacks in Mississippi and blacks everywhere, they didn't have the right to vote in Mississippi. They couldn't vote. So they brought down white students to be part of their campaign, because with the white students, the whole eyes of the nation would come down. That's how it worked. And these students, many of them singly became leaders of big movements for the rest of the decade. It all kind of started here and with that. So there was a lot of things I wanted to show that many remained on the cutting room floor. It's true on this one, but we added 35 other scenes to our DVDs as extras, over 4 hours. And this thing is 8.5 hours long. So we didn't have to leave it on the floor, we could put it onto our DVDs, which is a little bit more satisfying because you cut all these things and you lose people you think are great and they can't be in the movie. So, you know, the digital age, I think, is a great age for being able to make films now. It's much, much easier and much, much more accessible. But I start with concepts, you know, and so that's going to tell me how to weave a story, okay? And I did the same thing with this. The concept of this one was about the interrelationship of the struggle inside South Africa and to those outside, which meant it limited what I covered. I only covered events inside South Africa as they affected what the rest of the world did. I only covered things outside South Africa as they really impacted what happened in South Africa. So it allowed me to weave through stuff and say, okay, I'm not going to deal with you, or you, or you. Because otherwise you just get overwhelmed. So you have to have something that guides you through a story. You know, so is that what you're asking?
Almost, yeah. I mean, it's. I meant maybe that I understand the concept thing, but because for me it's a really, really thorough job that has been done. I mean, that's it's not just a film; it's a research, and it's a huge research, and that's why I'm always surprised when I see something like this, and then I feel that how you start something like this. It's not and maybe you gave us a small clue about it, but still maybe there are.
Well, I would say like the first film I ever made was like that. Okay, so that's the first thing I ever did. I made a film that was original research because the scholars hadn't gotten to it, and it was about what happened during women in World War II, and how they got pulled into all these industries that they weren't supposed to work in because they were women, and how they got kicked out when the war was over, and how they got all these films made in the 50s saying, oh, you must make babies, and all these other things you have to do. So, and that runs counter to the films made in the 40s saying, oh, please, women, you have to come work here. So it was, and it was original research, but and the civil rights story was not so difficult to do. I mean, that was something that was not original research, and this was, though. And believe me, I would never do this again. If I knew now, when I started, I would have never done it. Never. This has been extremely difficult, and it's also because you have to. It's done in what I guess people today consider an old style of filmmaking, and what I was told at your film school were talking heads, bad. But anyway, I don't know.
Now they are coming back into the fashion. So.
Well, that's good. That's not what the kids do. But anyway, It actually, I had to spend so much time figuring out the story. I could never say, oh, I'm going to experiment with some new way to do this or that or that. So it was, and it was enormously difficult to structure, which I can talk with you afterwards about. That was extremely difficult to do. But anybody have any questions or thoughts? Or, yeah?
Did you write the script for this film or someone else?
I don't write scripts. A script wasn't written. The film gets made in the editing room, and I work with the editors, and we make the story. I don't work with, so that's how. I will hire some writers to finesse the narration. There isn't very much. I usually don't try to work with much narration, but sometimes you need a little bit. And we do the first writing, and then maybe someone comes in and kind of polishes it throughout the whole series. But it gets written in the editing room. There isn't a script. And the way I work is that I lay out the story first in what I call paper cuts. I mean, and that's the audio component of the story. We transcribe all our interviews, we transcribe all of our archival footage, and I make a story, you know, I call it a paper cut. And then that's the first thing that the editor works with, and we put that together, and then we start working with it from that, but that's how it gets done.
Now you can see from this huge work that is inside the film that you have done, and I think it's almost impossible to comprehend this one, and then if I have to realize that there are 7 of those films, and every one of those is made with such a, I think, perfection. Yeah, you can call it perfection. Yeah. It was really good to see it.
Yeah, people work different ways, but it's basically, I have to get scripts written to get funding from one of the organizations that funded this film, which is the National Endowment for Humanities, which is a U.S. government organization. We have 2 endowments that the government set up. One is the humanities, one of the arts, and I got funding from both. And the humanities is sort of set up to bring, you know, humanities issues like histories and scholars together with people who can then make something that gets more out to the public. That's sort of its reason for being there. So I have a lot of scholastic advisors on this, but this film, it was difficult because the people only knew their little area. I mean, nobody had really written a thing about the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And so my key advisor was actually this guy at the United Nations who worked for the UN, had a special committee on apartheid. And so he was my best source because he's the one who really knew everything, and nobody else kind of did. And but they were helpful in certain areas. So I had to write scripts before I'd done stuff and to get them to funding. And so they funded part of the film, so I had to write 2 scripts for 2 parts of it for them, but that was literally to get funding. And I was hoping we could then use it to edit well with, but it just never works that way.
Mm-hmm. And was those interviews which were made for this film was useful for afterwards for other films? Or I mean, the people you interviewed, did you cut them in the other films? Or,
yeah. Some of them are in the other films. Baron du Plessis, who was with the South African government and was in the 80s, their finance minister, is in a lot of other films. And Les de Villiers, who I have here, a short part, who was part of the South African Department of Information and their propaganda and dirty tricks unit. He's the one who worked outside of South Africa trying to prevent the movements from being effective, and they did all kinds of things, including killing people. And he's in a bunch of other episodes. Abdul Minty, who is the Indian man who first worked with Dennis Brutus in England, is in a lot of other episodes because he was key to the whole British anti-apartheid movement, and they were one of the strongest in the world. And but most of these people are just for this episode.
Mm.
Most all of them.
So you weren't make the episodes parallelly, at the same time that every of 7 films were made. That you made it like separately, one film, then the next one, then the next one. I mean, in the sense of interviews, you interviewed. First of all, you interviewed people for one film, then for the second film.
No, what I did is it was a big gathering process, and the first thing I did was to go out and interview people all over the world. That's the first thing I did. Mm-hmm. And I first interviewed the older people because I was afraid of them dying before I ever figured out what the story was. So, and lots of people have died. Over 25 people that I've interviewed are dead now. Lots. And so I went around the world and did all the interviews. And
how many interviews?
What?
How many interviews are there?
135.
Huge number.
So, and then all that gets back. And when I was in those other countries, that's when I would do research at the archives and see what they had and bring that back. So it was a long time of just gathering things all over the world and bringing it.
But all 7 films were released last year, or there was a film which was released in 2006. Was it somehow different?
Yeah, well, what happened, we finished one episode first. We finished this American episode, and it's because a man who'd been one of my advisors on my civil rights film, and he was a professor at Stanford University. He raised me $100,000 to complete that film, to pay for the archival rights. So that got completed first. That's the one that was in 2006, and it got released first.
Okay. So
and then I guess this got done next, and the bottom line got done next, and there 1, 2, 3, and 7 were the last ones.
But no more left.
Mm-hmm.
There are no more left.
No, I'm not going to do it. People can do stuff later. But
okay. And what are your plans for now, for the next film?
I'm making a film that I shot in Palestine. I went there again on the auspices of the same guy from Stanford who raised me the money for that one episode. He had written a play about Martin Luther King, and it had been produced in the Chinese National Theater, and he'd always wanted me to go shoot that film, make a film about that, which I couldn't do because I was involved with this, and this time it was being produced by the National Theater of Palestine. And so he brought me there to film the play, but I thought it was too interesting a story. They were going to perform this play, and it was going to go all over the West Bank, and there was also involved an African-American group that came from America who provided all the gospel music from the era, and those people were really very devout Christians, seriously devout Christians, all of whom grew up in churches, were closely allied with Israel because the Bible tells you they're the chosen people. And we have many, many big Christian organizations in the United States that strongly support Israel, hell or high water. But anyway, but they're not necessarily in those churches right now. So I thought it would make a fascinating story to see this play about King being performed by Palestinians and find out what the actors' lives were like in Palestine, who were playing Martin Luther King, etc., plus what these African Americans saw and how they felt about it. Plus, there's a nonviolent movement going on, and one of the young leaders of it was actually a student at Stanford University. My friend is a professor, and he's one of the young leaders. And they're young people, much like the people in Tunisia and Egypt. And most people in my country don't see Palestinians that way. They're only portrayed mostly through the violence that gets reported, whether it's rockets from Gaza or bombs, or in the era when they were doing also a lot of terrorists blowing themselves up in the middle of Israeli shopping centers, which they did. But actually, there's been a big nonviolent movement in Palestine. It's gone on for a long time, and there's a big emphasis now to do that. And so I'm also making a film about that and this young person. And it's, you know, if they could ever get organized well enough to just do things that way, I think they'd be very effective. But I don't see soon that the rockets are going to stop or the other things that are going to go on. And they've kind of split movements in Palestine between Hamas and Fatah. So, but these kids are trying to unify it and do it differently. And so I thought it's just too interesting a story not to try to make a whole film about it. So I did it on basically no money. I shot a lot myself, and I don't normally shoot. I worked with people who were not very skilled, and it was quite an adventure, but I realized that it doesn't look so bad, and you know, I've got a lot of stuff I can work with. I have to go back one more time. But
so it's going to be released soon.
Well, I hope to get it done soon. I just kick-started it. Do you people know about Kickstarter? Ever hear of it?
No,
Do you know Kickstarter?
No,
okay, there's actually a lot of different sites like this, and what this is, it's on the internet. It was set up for anybody doing something creative. You can be doing artwork, you can be doing, someone's writing a cookbook about cakes and she's trying to get that funded. You basically, it's like crowdsourcing. It's become this new, you know, fundraising tool for all kinds of people, and they have one in the Netherlands. That's a friend of mine, Hetty Holman, is just using for her film. So because I'm grant funded, you know, I get funded through foundations, and that's fine if you're working on something that you can wait years to finish because it's not as immediate, but they run in cycles, and I missed all the spring cycles, and so I'm applying now to various places that they won't decide until next spring, and so I just felt this needed to get out sooner, so I did a Kickstarter campaign for it, which was very hair-raising. It was like going on a roller coaster ride, because you're sitting there wondering, is there going to be anything out there?
Yeah.
It was going to come. You have to work through networks, and it was really scary, but there were two things that were just amazing. One, I was amazed at my friends. My friends were unbelievably generous. It's just been astounding. I didn't expect that. I did organize them to say that you've got to get right at the beginning so when someone else comes, they can see other people are on it, you know, and they had their little instructions. And then I lined up people who would be my networkers team. These are people who had networks. And one of them I worked through, an Israeli woman is taking an organizing course in a place that I know in San Francisco. She's totally involved in the international BDS movement. I don't know if you know what that is. It's a boycott and divestment movement. Like what they did about South Africa, people are trying to do that around Israel, to try to force Israel to come to terms and get the thing settled by boycotting them. Just this is what they did in South Africa. It was very effective. And in fact, they were using one of my films. Somebody actually ripped it off from somewhere in the world, I don't know where, and it ended up in Jordan, and they translated it into Arabic, and it was being used all over. In fact, I spoke with it a couple of places in Palestine. So it was, but 2 weeks after I got started, so I lined myself up with those networks, up to pop another film that's about Palestine. And this one is about a comparison between apartheid in South Africa and Israel, showing how it's apartheid. Because apartheid is now, it's condemned legally, okay, in the international world. So if you can convince the international world that what Israel is doing is just like apartheid, it actually means something. But anyway, it's, and this people who are organizing around it really want. And I actually helped these people out 2 or 3 years ago and gave them a lot of free footage, and I was really pissed off. How did they jump on? They could see I was trying to raise money. So that kind of, I thought, sort of knocked out certain sources for me that I had set up, so I had to scramble again, and you know, who I was going to get, and I went through church groups, and I had this most hysterical, trying to work with one of the men I filmed for this, who was 94 years old, who had a great network, but on the phone trying to talk him through how to work stuff on his computer. It was just impossible. Finally, I had to send someone up there, but it really worked because he had a great network and got me hooked up with other networks, and so now that network started working, and somehow it all worked out. And because the way it works on Kickstarter, if you set a goal, you have to make your goal else you don't get anything.
Mm.
So I was aiming for $30,000, and if I didn't make it, I would see nothing. So it's very nerve-wracking. They certainly do it to push you, you know, to make sure. There's also sites like that, one called Indiegogo. They don't do that. Yeah, and they, you know, you can keep whatever you do. The trouble is, what they will do is take a larger percentage based on if you raise little. So they're going to take much more of your money if you raise little than if you raised a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So in all these ways, these sites are, you know, need to make money. Kickstarter takes 5%. But it's still really worth it, and it was the only way to raise some money, you know, quickly, to try to
and
get this
I think it works with social issues. It works.
Oh, it works with, you go to Kickstarter and see what gets funded. Believe me. Horror films get funded. This is a film about my dad, and you won't believe. And these things all get funded. It's a matter of knowing your networks. People have raised money so they can compete for an Academy Award, which to me is really crazy, because I figure, get yourself a distributor and get the theaters, and then you can do it. But they've won. They've gotten it because they've got enough networks of people who believe in them or their work to do it. And many of this stuff, I had about 355 people who contributed, and a lot of it's in just $25 chunks, which is easy really for people to do. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these things get funded by lots and lots of those, you know, sort of small chunks. So it's actually quite liberating. And then the other thing that it does that's very useful, especially if you're making social issue films, is you're building your community that's going to use the film as you're fundraising for it. And then you direct everybody over to your Facebook page, and you know, you just do all of that, so hopefully by the time the film's ready, everybody's ready to run with it and use it when it's done. So it's actually quite useful, besides just...
Yeah, of course, it's not only fundraising, it's always getting an audience who are interested in the film, in the results.
Yeah, because I want to get this out quickly. I mean, this took over 10 years. So
yeah.
I don't want to do that again.
We could see it.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things for an artist is to get inspiration. And what's their way to get
inspiration? Well, a lot of things I do kind of fall into my lap in odd ways, okay? But I pick up on it for certain reasons. And like actually with this film, after I finished the civil rights film, I really wanted to do something international. And so I was looking for things and exploring some ideas that weren't just sort of working out. And then I was having dinner with a very old friend of mine, and we'd actually gone together to see Nelson Mandela in 1990 when he came to our neighborhood, you know, around Oakland, California, and we were there, and it was an incredible occasion. He went on a world tour afterwards and just went all over the world thanking people. So we were talking, and so he just said, well, why don't you do that? And I said, oh, anti-apartheid movement. And I said, well, it seemed to make sense. It was international, and I thought I could get my same backers who funded my previous films to back this one, and I thought I'd get international financing too. So it sort of made sense to do it, and I knew how to do these films, and people knew I knew how to do them. And a lot of that fell into place. I did get Ford, and I did get the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Arts who funded me before. I didn't get any international funding. And the BBC, Nick Fraser was actually going to fund my sports one. And they said they were giving me £120,000, and for this episode, and it was all fine, and I actually spent a special trip in South Africa to set things up and did pre-interviews with, I was going to expand, you know, the story and get to London. I'll go there to meet with them on the way back, and the staff takes me to lunch in the basement of a restaurant. That's not a good sign. To tell me their budgets had been cut, and they cut it. So they weren't going to give me anything. But they are showing the whole thing, and and it's been shown a lot of places. And it's, so that's what did it. But the reason I did it, the reason I took it on is because it was global. It's like what I said in the beginning, we live in a globalized world, and these are globalized tactics, and it has a lot to teach people, and inspire people, let people know that you can do this. I mean, in one of our episodes, it's about getting multinational companies to leave South Africa, and banks. And you kind of think about that. I remember, how can you do that? Well, people did it. It's a combination of not just people on the outside, it's also what people were doing in South Africa. It worked hand in hand, and I showed that in the film, but incredible amounts of things were done in this situation. And so I find it a really inspiring story about, what people can accomplish, against all kinds of difficult odds. And as I explained before, because of the Cold War, this was a really difficult struggle, really hard. So, but that's why I did it, because I thought it would be, useful in that way. I don't think I would never do something like this again. I used to wake up in the middle of the night saying, a series. I don't like TV. I don't even like being on TV. Why am I doing this? And it has been, kind of, if you have one film, you can go out and appear with it all over the place, and it's very kind of satisfying. It's very hard to do that with 7 films. And each film on their own doesn't quite do it. It really is just part of the story. So it's been difficult in that way. I did show the whole thing in New York City. I was able to get a theater to show it. We've got a great theater there, the Film Forum, that did it. Played all 8.5 hours. It got reviewed in all the newspapers, and I got great reviews, which was very satisfying. And people got the whole story, because you don't get it until you see the whole thing, what it means. I would never do this again.
Did you manage to meet Nelson Mandela for an interview?
I met Nelson Mandela, but I didn't get an interview with him, and I didn't fight for it. Because this story isn't about him. What I did in this story is make it about Oliver Tambo. Do you know who Oliver Tambo is? Anybody ever hear his name? Well, he's the person in the ANC who made all this happen. Remember, Nelson Mandela's in jail.
Yeah.
He was in jail for 27 years. What could he do? Oliver Tambo did it, and Oliver Tambo got sent out of the country in 1960 to keep the ANC together in exile and, and get the world involved in their struggle. And he did an extraordinary job. So he's the character that I'm really portraying, and not Nelson Mandela. So once it wasn't like that to get any, I just dropped it because it really wasn't necessary to do.
The last episode in your film showed the same events which were shown in
Invictus.
Invictus, yes, in Clint Eastwood film. How do you feel about that one?
I think they lost a huge opportunity with that film and for the life of me, I can't dramatically, in terms of drama, not done certain things. They got my film, I sent it to them, and I was trying to do some sort of cross-pollination and see if they wanted to put my film on their DVD and trying to, which they weren't interested in, but they saw the whole thing. It told them the whole story, and for them not to tell the audience that the Springboks used to be the best team in the whole world, it made it seem like they were just some lump team that wasn't very good, and through Nelson Mandela they were spirited and they could win this thing. Well, that wasn't the truth. They'd been the best in the world. So that would have made it a much stronger drama if they'd done that. And I don't know why. So I didn't particularly think the film was very good.
Yeah, I feel the same.
Yeah. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Do you find it easier to make documentaries about current events rather than about historical, quite, well, for some people, controversial things where you have to heavily rely on the archives and other people's memories?
It's much harder to do the archival films. I did a film about international work of Cuban doctors, because they're all over the world, that I was actually hired to do. And for me, it was like taking a vacation. Okay, even though on some levels it was difficult, we went to places like the Mesquite coast of Honduras, where we were in villages where there weren't any roads, and we had to drive through the ocean to get there. And there were no motels, hotels, restaurants. There was no electricity, and there was no running water. And we slept in the houses that were run down and nobody lived in anymore. On the beds nobody would sleep in. I mean, that's what that was like. But to me, it was like a vacation. It was much, much easier to do. And it's very taxing on a director to do these kinds of films, because you have to be incredibly prepared when you're questioning and interviewing people, and you have to be incredibly on, you know. And I do a lot of setup, so it would take us 2 hours to set up our shots. I thought a lot about where we were shooting. You know, I just won't shoot anywhere. You shouldn't shoot people against blank walls, and I shoot with a lot of depth of field. And as you can tell from it, it's very well lit, and because this was so big, I often tried to do 3 interviews a day, and that was really tough. So it's very exhausting, and intellectually, it's much harder in terms of putting your story together and figuring things out, and the other kinds of films are much easier.
Yeah,
And I don't want to make historical films again either. I'm done with it. Done. Do something else. Any other questions, or do any of you guys make films, or no? You just like to watch them? So, did you have any problem with understanding the English in this one?
No, I think almost everything was
Yeah,
comprehensible. There's some partially, some of the guys who were in New Zealand, and maybe there was some sentences you couldn't catch, but I think mostly it was very well understandable.
Good. So do you have any more questions or anything?
I think not now.
Okay.
So we will say thank you, and it was, I think it was an inspirational evening tonight. And thanks.